Okay, Brian, do you need me to share? Do you want to share your screen?
Or do
Or
you
you want
want to
me
just do
to?
this? Can you do it for me and I'll just ask you to do the slides because
Okay, hold on just a minute. Which one do you want? The PowerPoint?
yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm using the PDF.
Okay. It's whatever.
Okay. And did somebody turn on? Yeah, somebody turned on the transcript. Thank you. Okay, so go ahead.
All right. And it's real quickly. My name is Brian Lords. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Alabama. But I think the real reason Kathy asked me to do this is I also serve as an election inspector in Limestone County. So I've gotten to see the process from that point of view. I do want to apologize. Usually, I'm going to read a lot of this today. I usually don't like doing that, but there's a lot of kind of fine points I want to make sure I touch on. And if I just talk to the slides, I sometimes skip stuff. And a disclaimer is, I'm not a lawyer, so what I'm giving you this is not legal advice. It's based on, again, either my training from being an inspector or reading through the Alabama Code, the Alabama Administrative Code as part of the advocacy team of the League of Women Voters. And again, my perspective from this is probably going to be a little different than yours. So if you have different perspectives than mine, please let me know, because I always like to learn and say, oh, yeah, I never thought about it from that perspective. Next slide, Kathy. I'm going to start with a list of topics that I'm not going to be talking about very much in depth. One is the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. And there's some interesting stuff in there. They allow some extra time for absentee votes to come in, which is good. And there's an option to use some electronic voting options, which generally Alabama doesn't use. But I don't want to get too much into that particular act. Emergency absentee voting is very limited. Generally, you'll see, like in Limestone County, we might get 3 or 4 of those in an election. So I don't want to spend much time on that. Provisional absentee ballots is another case where, again, you get very few provisional absentee ballots. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. And I'm not going to talk about the polling process, is basically what they do on election day, counting those ballots. There's a few minor differences, but it's pretty similar to a regular precinct. I'm not going to talk about that. So it should be slide 3, Kathy, obtaining an absentee ballot. Great. Of course, the first step in absentee voting is to obtain your ballot. And to do that, you need to get an application. And again, the in-person absentee balloting is the best way. You can vote absentee. If you can get to the absentee election manager's office, it has the quickest turnaround. The absentee election manager will identify any issues and will have the ability for you to address them. And I'll talk about later some of the issues that we can come up with. They will provide necessary signatures and witnesses for the affidavit. Of course, the issue is if you can get to the absentee election manager's office, you could probably vote regularly at a poll. So I'm not sure that's a good option. But to get an application, you can either go to the Secretary of State or your local official website and print one out, or you can request one be mailed to you. And once you have the application, you need to fill it out and return it to the absentee election manager, and that can be done by post, USPS, commercial care, in person. And in most cases, you need to include a copy of your photo ID. And if it's returned by hand, it must be delivered by the voter requesting the absentee ballot. No one else can deliver your application for you. Next slide, please. Time frame. The time frame for absentee ballots at times can make the process very difficult, especially with runoff elections. With the current state of the U.S. mail, you need to plan at least 3 weeks if you do the entire process by mail, and that's a week for your application to get to the absentee election manager, a week to get your ballot back, and then even if you immediately fill it out, then you had a week for it to get back to meet the time frames. And the time frames with runoff elections are a little bit tighter because usually now they've gone down to 4 weeks between primaries and runoffs. So this year it's a little bit different. They've expanded to 6 weeks just because the runoff election would have been immediately after the Easter weekend, and that is, they think it would just cause a lot of problems with spring break and Easter weekend about getting ready for the elections. The good news on an absentee ballot application, you can send it in as far in advance of election as you want. There's no limit to how far in advance it is sent in, and the absentee election manager can accept it anytime within any time frame before the election. There's no cutoff, so you can send that in 70, a month, 2 months in advance of the election. And in-person absentee voting may begin as soon as the absentee election manager receives all the materials, but it has to be at least 55 days before an election. And runoff elections, they have to start the in-person absentee process no later than 2 weeks after the primary election. In-person absentee voting ends 5 days before the election, so there's at least 50 days in which you can vote in this way. And the absentee election manager will start sending out ballots, again, a minimum of 55 days before the election. So if you have your application in before that time, you should get it in plenty of time. But once time goes passes, applications sent by mail must be received no later than 7 days before an election. And again, we strongly recommend if you're within 7 days of election, there's no way the mail these days you'll be able to send it in, get your ballot back, fill out your ballot, and return it within those 7 days. So if you get, we like to say 3 weeks. If you're within 3 weeks of the election, rather than depending on the mail system and using the absentee ballot that way, you're best to try to do in-person absentee balloting. And again, applications delivered by hand must be received no less than 5 days before the election. And again, if you're going to do this, if you're going to deliver your application by hand, you might as well just do the whole process while you're at the absentee election manager's office. Again, you can deliver your application. They will review it. If it's correct, they will hand you a ballot. You can go off. Usually they have an area set aside where you can go off and vote. You bring it back, and they will provide the witnessing and all that. They will check and make sure everything's in order so the ballot will count. And ballots delivered to the absentee election manager in person need to be done by the close of business the day before the election. And if you mail your ballot back or use a commercial carrier, it has to be received by the absentee election manager by noon on election day. Next slide, please. Going to get into some of the excuses that are allowed to be able to vote absentee. First one is the person expects to be out of the county on election day. I've asked that question, and I think it's been interpreted. If you're outside the county for an hour on election day, you can use it as an excuse. The person has a physical illness or infirmity which prevents their attendance at the polls. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this on the next slide. The person's working a shift that has at least 10 hours, which coincide with the hours the polls are open. The person is enrolled as a student at an educational institution located outside their county of their personal residence, which prevents attendance at the polls. And a side note of this one, Alabama, it's pretty flexible as far as you have the option of either voting at their permanent residence or changing their residence to if they're living at school and voting in the local county. And that's a decision. It's up to the student to make which way they want to do it. The person is a member, spouse, or dependent of a member of the armed forces pursuant to the Uniform and Overseas Citizens Overseas Absentee Voting Act. The person has been appointed as an election officer or poll watcher at a location other than their regular voting place. The person is a caregiver for a family member that is confined to their home, and that's the second degree kinship is how far you can go on that one. Or the person is incarcerated and not lost their voting rights due to a disqualifying felony. And any of these excuses allow you to vote by absentee. I'm going to go on to the next slide and talk about the excuses dealing with physical incapacity. And on the slide is what there's really two excuses there. One excuse just says I am physically incapacitated and will not be able to vote in person on election day. And then the next excuse is I am physically incapacitated and will not be able to vote in person on election day. I am unable to access my assigned polling location due to neurological, musculoskeletal, respiratory, including speech organs, cardiovascular, or other life-altering disorder that affects my ability to perform manual tasks, stand for any length of time, walk unassisted, see, hear, or speak. Excuse me. And then after that, there's two options under that. One says I am an elderly voter, age 65 or older. And the second choice on there is I'm a voter with a disability. And that becomes important because if you meet one of those two, the first condition and either of those second ones, you're not required to provide an ID.
Brian, that was one that with an and, it has all of that above and A and B, A or and.
No, I think it's an or. Hang on.
I think I'm at, well, it says see, hear, or speak, and then it's got an and.
You have to meet
A or
you have
B.
to meet the first one and then one of the second ones, I believe is.
Yeah, I was just saying that it was and or instead of being, it wasn't like just a subtext. It was actually all of that above and.
Oh, yes, you're absolutely correct. You have to basically have a condition of disability and then meet one of those other two. But my kind of point of discussion here is that the first one, which just talks about having a physical disability, that requires an ID. And I would argue that, if you have one of the things they don't define in any law that I could find with a disability, whether it's a permanent one or a temporary one. So if I'm temporarily can't access my polling location, I would think that first excuse would apply and I wouldn't need to apply an ID. And Kathy, if you go on to the next slide, this is out of some of the code. It says again, voter 65 and has a specific disability. But if you look at the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act, the definition, it talks about a temporary or permanent physical disability. And then in the Alabama code, the way I interpret that bottom one from the Code of Alabama, section 7930, and I abbreviated this a little bit because it also talks about UACAVA, but it says the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act, or any of their laws shall not be required to produce identification prior to voting. So I kind of take all that to mean if you have a disability, you don't have to provide an ID, but the way that Alabama has written their law, it sounds like certain cases they're still going to require the ID. And that may be one of the cases, again, that it may be non-compliance with the U.S. law. So go on to slide
8.
Slide 8. That's the right one. Okay, I want to make sure I'm the right number. This has to deal with permanent disability absentees. A person who has a permanent disability can be placed on the absentee voter list and have a ballot automatically mailed to them before each election. And boy, does that sound good. Except when you start reading the rules of doing this. And it says an application shall be required, or the application form must be signed and notarized by the disabled voter's primary physician. This application is valid for all elections in a year or an election cycle. The application must be resubmitted on an annual basis. So that seems like a lot of work to me to go by, and you're going to get 2 or 3 elections at it in most cases. It says the application must be submitted to the absentee election manager in this, and it's done in the same way as you would a regular absentee application. It either has to be mailed in or hand delivered. The absentee election manager will add the voter's name to a list of permanently disabled voters. And then if you get the absentee ballot, the rules for returning that, the ballot are exactly the same as the rules for returning the application are the same as a regular application again. So you're not getting anything there. And again, a separate application is required for your municipal election. So like if you happen to be in a place in Alabama where they have both municipal and regular elections, you have to do 2 of them. So to me, this seems like some awful onerous requirements to make it almost harder than doing a regular absentee vote. Again, it requires your application be signed and notarized by your primary care physician. And in my case, that means your physician needs to be familiar with the law. I assume they want to know what they're signing. And also I don't know if it's typical for notaries to be president of the physician's office, and the law specifically prohibits remote notarization. Again, it's only good for 1 year. And there's one interesting part of the application is there's a block of check that states, deliver an absentee ballot to me by electronic transmission for all federal elections. I provided an email address above. However, I did research on this. I could find nowhere where they tell you how to do this, how that process actually works.
Might be interesting for someone to try it out, but
I'd be interested to know if anybody in this group has tried that or knows anyone that's tried it and how it works. Again, and I may touch on this a little bit later, but the UOCAVA allows some electronic transmission of ballots. So that process should be in place already in Alabama. It's just obviously the election officials want to discourage it and don't trust it. Okay, application assistance, Kathy. Any applicant may receive assistance in filling out the application as he or she desires, but each application shall be manually signed by the applicant. And if the applicant signs by a mark or just an X, then the name of the witness to his or her signature shall be signed. And this is kind of unusual for Alabama law, because most of the times when someone assists another person, either with voter registration or actually at the polls, if someone has assistance at the polls, that person has to sign that they're assisting this person. And I'm kind of surprised that for the absentee ballot application, they don't have that requirement. Next slide, please. Should be slide 10. Absentee ballot materials. When you receive your absentee ballot package, it will contain 5 items. It should have your ballot, a secrecy envelope, an affidavit envelope, a pre-addressed return envelope, and it has instructions that tells you how to fill out the ballot, and it's also supposed to give you instructions on what to do if you make a mistake with your ballot, how you can get a new ballot or fix the issue. I've seen several different sets of instructions. I've never seen that last piece that it tells you how to get a new ballot on in the instruction.
Can you talk to them about how you would request a new ballot? Because I know I screwed mine up one time. I called the circuit clerk. I called the circuit clerk and told them I messed it up, and they spoiled it.
There is the absentee ballots all have a serial number on them, so you can call up and say, please spoil this ballot so it won't count. The issue becomes then you have to get a new ballot, again, depending on the time frame and stuff. Do you have time to have them mail it to you and get it back in time, or do you end up going back down? I mean, again, the preferred way, if you can do it, is if I make a mistake in my ballot, just go back to absentee election manager, turn in the one you had made a mistake on, have them give you a new one. But and again, that's back. A lot of people don't have access to or the ability to do that.
You were talking about the absentee ballot period. 55 days before November 6th is like mid-September, right? That people could, if they're going to vote absentee, they've got between mid-September and the week before the election to go down and vote absentee at the courthouse.
Correct.
And wherever it is.
Yeah. And again, that's a good thing. But again, if you have issues where, it's difficult for you to go to your polling location, again, a lot of the absentee election managers, you have the same issues. The only really benefit, you have a longer window of time. So if it's a transportation issue, it gives you extra time to be able to arrange transportation.
That's true.
So,
all right, you ready for the next slide?
Hang on 1 minute. Let me look. I was just going to touch on base. When you vote in your polling location, they consider your ballot's not considered cast till it's actually in the tabulating machine. And an absentee, what I've been told is once you mail it back or you've hand delivered it to the absentee election manager, it's considered cash and they won't let you do anything about trying to fix it then. So even if an absentee election manager notice, and I'll touch on this a little bit, notice a mistake, right now we don't have any way of fixing it. And there's one other thing, the Secretary of State does have a ballot tracking system, but it's used inconsistently, I think, throughout the state. And all it really tells you when you send in your application, I think they'll say application received, it will say ballot uh, sent, or I don't remember that word. They'll
Accepted.
tell you what
They use the word
well,
accepted, and they said
there's something when it's on the way back, there's something that says, okay, we sent the ballot out, but then when they get the ballot back, it says ballot accepted. And that just really means they've received it back. It doesn't tell you whether it's going to be counted or not. So I just wanted to touch base. So there is a system, but again, I've not been able to find the detailed rules on that. By talking to some people here in Limestone County, the absentee election manager says there's received and then changes to accepted when everything's good. But that's very rare. It sounds like most just when they put accepted in that, you don't know the status of that ballot.
Last April, I was just going to say, last April, I met with the circuit clerk, the head of the Circuit Clerk Association, and about 3 of the circuit clerks, including Carla Woodall from Dothan, and they confirmed what you said, that the tracking system does not guarantee. If they say accepted, it does not mean that your affidavit envelope is acceptable.
Right.
All right.
Absentee ballot process, again, in my opinion, it's a fairly complicated process. You have to mark the ballot. The ballot then has to be inserted into the secrecy envelope and sealed. Then you must complete the affidavit envelope that includes address information and a reason, again, of why you are voting absentee, even though that was on the application. You either have to get a notary or 2 other people to witness your signature, and then the completed affidavit envelope must be placed in the return envelope, and the entire package needs to be either mailed back to the absentee election manager. You can use a commercial carrier or return in person. And again, currently, if it's returned in person, you have to return your own ballot. No one else can return your ballot for you. Next slide, please. And this last slide, I'm going to, again, one more caveat. These last slide is either rules that I think make the process difficult or issues as I see them. So a lot of these are my opinion. I need to caveat that. One thing I think the lack of a consistent definition about what is a disabled person for the purpose of election. And I went back and looked at ADA, and ADA, they have their definition, but they specifically say this is not a legal definition. It's what we use, and there's different definitions for things like Social Security, disability, and stuff. I think this makes people hesitant about giving assistance, given that we're in an environment where it seems like certain election officials are looking to make cases that absentee voting is filled with fraud, and they're looking to bring cases to court to say this is fraud. And again, the legislatures are looking at a couple other bills that will add some more misdemeanors and felonies to election violations, even making it more hesitant for people to want to help. You can only have one absentee ballot application sent in an envelope. You have many households that have more than one person that want to vote absentee, but they need to be sent in separate envelopes. You also need make sure that you know where you want your absentee ballot sent. They will send it to the address you were registered at, but like if you're going to be on vacation or out of town for a while and wanted your ballot sent to a different location, you have to make sure you specify that on the application. If again, when you send back the affidavit, if the place of residence, reason for voting absentee, and the voter doesn't sign the affidavit, the signature is not notarized or witnessed, the envelopes are not in the correct sequence, or if it was a provisional, they didn't put the ID in the correct envelope, just the third envelope, the absentee vote will not be counted. That's a lot of opportunity to make mistakes, so your vote won't be counted there. Again, I mentioned previously before, there's no means to cure a ballot that has mistakes. Many states, including Georgia, now allow for ballot curing. An absent ballot is considered cast when it's mailed or handed to the absent election manager. In person, voting changes can be made up until the time where the ballot is inserted in the tabulator. So if you do it early and the absentee election manager knows there's a mistake, they should be, my opinion is they should be able to notify a voter and allow them opportunity to come and fix it, especially if something as just simple as not checking the excuse or not, you're missing a signature. Right now, currently, there is no mechanism to allow anyone else to deliver your application or ballot package to you, to the absentee election manager. The requirements for who has to provide ID are not clear in some cases. And again, although the law requires instructions on guidance what to do if they don't include the instructions with absentee ballots. And again, the absentee ballot instruction is not available in a format that visually impaired can use. And having said that, that's basically what I was going to cover about the process. Again, hopefully give you an idea of some of the many rules in this process that make it very tricky. And I'll be happy to try to answer any questions. And I also say I'd love to hear any experiences people that have used this process have run into.
I'm going to stop recording right now, and then we'll talk.